The harder it is to afford things, the harder it is to get childcare, the more expensive it is to go to school, the more people are going to be open to the argument that these things cost too much. The only way you're going to be able to have it is that the government provides it for you. And so once the government begins, the government doesn't just take over early childhood education. It decides when it takes it over what's being taught and who gets to teach it. It doesn't just take over higher education. It decides what you have to teach and who gets to go. It doesn't just take over when it sends you the check in the mail every month. It doesn't just decide how much money you have in the bank. It makes you dependent on that program continuing and having to increase taxes on other people in order for the money to be there to do that. So in many ways, I think this inflation is an example, and even the supply chain shortages create a scenario in which people, they think, become more open to becoming dependent on government to fill in their needs, because the economy can't do it. Only government can do it. And that's the fundamental argument they're making, right? Is that these are important things in life. Private economy cannot provide it for you, cannot provide you this security. Only government can. But that always comes at the price of your freedom and liberty, both economic and personal.
Is that our biggest problem outside of our borders, that if we don't do anything, nobody else will? And sort of after 20 years of failed nation building, like the American people, as you said, people don't want, well, they certainly don't want a ground war. I don't think they want any sort of war. I don't want a war. I don't want a nation build. But I understand we do have a unique place in the world. And if we're not the ones kind of saying, bad guys, you can't always do whatever you want to do, it's like then all bets are off.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you're going to be a country as big and as powerful with an economy as advanced as ours, then what happens around the world is going to matter to you, because you're sourcing products, you're sourcing raw material, energy, trade, commerce all over the world. And so you need there to be stability. The one thing you can never allow happen, for example, is, let's say China comes to dominate the Asia Pacific region. And so suddenly we can't trade. We've just lost all those countries in Asia that we sell things to and buy things from. We have to deal with China, and they decide what to sell or buy from us. So a lot of that's really domestic. Like, we have to have an industrial capability in this country. We have to have the ability. You cannot be a great power if you're not an industrial power. I don't care what people tell you. You can't just be the place that invents things on paper and then ships it off for someone else to make it. Eventually, the people making these things are the people that will invent them, and not to mention the national security ramifications of it. So number one, we have to be an industrial power. Number two, we have to make sure that we don't live in a world in which a great power dominates a region and basically we have no access to people that want to trade and commerce with us. That said, that has to be balanced against the notion of overextension. There are a lot of bad things that happen in the world. We need to speak about it and do what we can, but most of them do not have an American military solution, nor should they, in terms of us getting involved and overextending ourselves. Our number one priority must always be the national interest of our country and protecting it from threats, both at home and our interest around the world. And it's a balance that you have to pull off in public policy. But to your greater point about no one else will do it, I think a lot of times what happens is if America isn't involved, then some people will get involved, but they're going to get involved in ways that may not necessarily further our national interest. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example, has led a lot of countries in the Middle East to increasingly turn to China and Russia as their defense partner preference. And that's concerning, because that could mean for the future of American economic prosperity and security.
Do you think some of this is sort of by design? Like when you see the way a guy like, say, Bill de Blasio kind of wrecked New York City, which is just an absolute disaster, a place that I lived most of my adult life before moving to LA. You know, people are like, oh, you know, this is an accident. You know, like these policies, he didn't realize what was going to happen, but he just gave a speech a couple days ago where it's like, oh no, this was great. It's all great here. And I feel the sort of similar way with Biden. It's like, I don't know that he really thinks things aren't going well. Now you look at the shelves and you look at people's jobs and everything else, and you clearly realize the price of gas, the price of food, et cetera. You realize things aren't, but do you think some of it is actually by design, that it's a feature, not a bug, in a way, of the way they govern?
Both. I think it's the natural consequence of these decisions. They always lead to disaster. But I also don't think that, I think they're not necessarily overly troubled by it. Inflation's a great example. Inflation, if you believe that you want Marxism or socialism and you want the government to control more of our economy, then inflation isn't necessarily a bad thing. Because the way you view it is, the more expensive life gets, right, the harder it is to afford things, the harder it is to get childcare, the more expensive it is to go to school. the more people are going to be open to the argument that these things cost too much. The only way you're going to be able to have it is that the government provides it for you. And so once the government begins, the government doesn't just take over early childhood education. It decides when it takes it over what's being taught and who gets to teach it. It doesn't just take over higher education. It decides what you have to teach and who gets to go. It doesn't just take over when it sends you the check in the mail every month. It doesn't just decide how much money you have in the bank. It makes you dependent on that program continuing and having to increase taxes on other people in order for the money to be there to do that. So in many ways, I think this inflation is an example, and even the supply chain shortages create a scenario in which people, they think, are become more open to becoming dependent on government to fill in their needs, because the economy can't do it. Only government can do it. And that's the fundamental argument they're making, right? Is that these are important things in life. Private economy cannot provide it for you, cannot provide you this security. Only government can. But that always comes at the price of your freedom and liberty, both economic and personal.
Yeah, and that's what I mean about feature, not a bug. It's like a guy like de Blasio, he wrecked New York City, but in his view, it's like, oh, but the government's doing more now. So thus, this is good. Right. And I think that that's sort of what's going on all over the place. So to that point, obviously there's midterms coming. Everybody's talking about some big red wave or something. I'm pretty sure we're going to be safe here in Florida. By the way, do you say Florida or Florida? I'm a New Yorker originally, so I say Florida. Everyone's else saying Florida here. But I also say orange juice, not orange juice. So I don't know. No one's ever.
I've heard about Nevada and Nevada, but I've never heard of Florida and Florida. I don't know what I say. Florida. I don't know.
You say Florida. Yeah. I say Florida. People are telling me it's a New York thing. Yeah. We say Florida. We say orange instead of orange. But what do you think is going to happen in this midterm situation? I mean, do you think we can actually capture? I mean, I never would have said we before, but I think it's we at this point. Get the House back. It sounds like the Senate's going to do pretty well. I mean, what do you sense?
Well, the easiest way to lose at anything is to act like you're winning. So I think that's the first thing we have to keep in mind. The second is, these guys raise a lot of money. Okay, as an example, right? Chuck Schumer went out and handpicked Val Demings, the congresswoman from Central Florida, who was just a puppet of Nancy Pelosi, and said, that's who I want to be our candidate in Florida. And she's raising, $10 million a quarter or more online, just sending out an email. So they're going to raise that kind of money for candidates. Every Senate Republican incumbent was outraised in 2020 and in 2018. So we can't overlook the fact that these people are going to outraise us. We're also not going to get any benefit from media. As a perfect example, okay, I was ranked the most effective Republican senator by the Vanderbilt University of Virginia program that looks at the effectiveness of members of Congress. Another group, again, nonpartisan, ranked me the number 2 in leadership score, passed a bunch of really meaningful bills, not the least of which was the creation of the Paycheck Protection Program that literally saved millions of small business jobs in this country. You wouldn't know that. A couple of weeks ago, it was my work and having to blow up the defense bill that forced Nancy Pelosi in the House to pass a bill that banned the import of products made by Uyghur slave laborers. None of that stuff is reported on. The media is a real challenge for us because they're not going to report on our accomplishments or accurately, in many cases, to put out what we're working on or what our position is on these issues. And so I wouldn't take that for granted either. So these guys are going to have more money and they're going to have the benefit of mainstream media. So we're going to have to work real hard to make sure that our base knows what's going on, that people turn out and vote. Do I feel good about the direction of Florida? Do I feel good about the fact that people are realizing Joe Biden is a disaster? Absolutely. But the election isn't today. It's in November. We've got a long ways to go between now and then. And we got to make sure that people keep learning, not just about what they're doing wrong, but what we're going to do right if they give us the chance to be in the position of controlling the Senate and House.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.